Hello and welcome to part 2 of how to paint this Death Guard Space Marine. So in the first video I showed you a little bit about how to paint the armour and the trim, the non-metallic trim. And in this video we're just going to be finishing off a lot of things really. Starting with his gun. And so in the previous video I mentioned these different colours that you could mix together to make the non-metallic trim, so it's kind of like a coppery kind of colour. But I did mention that you could use Bugmans Glow and Cadian Fleshtone and get a very similar result, if not a superior one. So the question is, why did I do the mixing? And I just didn't have the colours to hand, so I just quickly made some up. But in this video, I did have, I purposely went out and found the colours. So here I'm using Bugmans Glow and Cadian Fleshtone. So if you do want to paint the kind of like copper colours, then I would suggest going with Bugmans Glow, Cadian Fleshtone, Mournfang Brown and Ice Yellow, and that'll give you quite a nice colour for it. You can see I'm just doing some very simple light placement at the minute using the Bugmans Glow, and it's all you have to do is just make sure everything kind of roughly lines up. Now again, you can hold the model under a lamp and it'll give you a good guide for how the light hits the model, and it'll also give you kind of some rough positioning for the light volumes as well, and by that I mean the shape of the highlights. But you have to remember though that it is shining on, in this case, Rhinox hide paint, which isn't a metallic surface, whereas like an actual metallic surface will give you a slightly different shine in effect. But that doesn't matter too much. It's close enough. It is a shiny surface, and with the colours that you're adding, and you can tweak it a little bit, and it'll be close enough to give you a non-metallic effect. You can see on the coils here that I'm painting. So I'm not painting the whole of the coil. It's just kind of like about a third of the curvature, and going over it a couple of times. So make sure your paint is reasonably thin. You could probably get away with 50-50, but you could, if you want to make sure that you have a really smooth finish, then you add a little bit more water and do multiple coats. Or if you're just feeling a bit lazy and you just want to do it in one coat, then you can edge more towards 1.5 parts paint to 1 part water. Just be a little bit careful, as I mentioned though, because it could end up that you'll have a slightly thicker surface. It's not necessarily a major problem, and if you're painting these more for very quick gaming models, then that kind of thing will be fine. Also at the end I do give the model a coat of matte varnish, and that does tend to even out the surfaces a little bit and fix those kind of problems if you have got slightly thicker paint. So if you want to paint it quicker, have thicker paint, use matte varnish, and it'll solve a lot of problems. If you're going to paint something for a bit higher level, spend a bit more time on, water the paints down, then you'll be able to do something more for like a competition type showpiece. Here you can see I'm painting in some bounce highlights again. So this is all just using Bugmans Glow at this point, and what you'll find is that when you painting these bounce highlights, it'll make it look much more metallic, because these are representing the reflections, say coming from the ground or whatever. We're not going to take these bounce highlights to be as bright as the highlights that are going to be for the main parts on top. But just at the moment, this is just so that everything gets mapped in. It makes it a little bit easier if you do everything with the first colour, and then you can push highlights higher or knock back some of the other highlights if they're too bright and things. Tweak it as you go along. But just mapping everything out with the one colour, it makes the job easier. You can kind of balance everything against what you've already done then as well. The only negative is for doing this kind of thing is it gets really boring, and so what I tend to do is I work on parts of the model. So in this case I'm working on the gun obviously, and then later on in the video you see me working on the backpack and things. Whereas if you just paint all of the model parts that are going to be copper, and you just get bored painting in just one colour all over the model. You did see that there's a tiny little bit of brown there. I think it was Mournfang brown. It doesn't matter too much what colour it is. It might have been Rhinox hide actually. But just to help blend in a little bit around that Bugmans Glow highlight that I placed on there. That is kind of like wet blending almost. you just kind of like dipping the brush while it's still wet with the paint from the Bugman's Glow into the Rhinox hide, and it'll mix on the model as you apply it. So you get kind of like it won't be as dark as the Rhinox hide and it won't be as light as the Bugman's Glow, but it just blends into it. So giving you kind of like a nice, very quick transition. It's not ideal for display painting or anything like that, and you can kind of see the dodgy marks all the way around it. But for a very quick highlight to give a kind of a roughly smooth transition, it works fairly nicely. Now you can see I've moved on to the Cadian Fleshtone. This is a lot lighter than Bugman's Glow, and you'll see straight away how it starts to look metallic just by adding this highlight. Now I've got this watered down quite a bit. I guess this is closer to the 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. When you have the paint watered down that little bit more, you have to be careful. Make sure you don't put too much paint on the brush, because if you overload the brush when you apply it, when the paint is kind of extra wet, it's just going to flood the area. Whereas if you just have the small amount of paint on there, because it's extra wet, it's still going to take a while to dry. It just means that the paint transfer won't just completely flood off the brush onto the model, and also because the paint dries a little bit on the brush while you're using it, so having less paint on the brush when the paint is very wet, it just makes life a little bit easier to control the paint. And you can see the placement for these highlights. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's just going straight over the top of the highlights that you've already placed, but just in a smaller area, so you can still see some of the Bugman's Glow showing at the edges. Also, because the paint is a bit thinner, so remember I said that for this one I'm using it around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. It's not like exact, so always test your paint. You can test it on your thumb or on a bit of plastic or something you've got lying around, whatever, but it just helps you to double check for the consistency and things. But because I've got it watered down quite a bit, what you'll find is when you first apply it, when it's wet, it looks quite a strong colour, but as it dries, you'll see that it's a very translucent layer, so some of the previous colour paint will show through, so the Bugman's Glow will kind of be visible, so it gives a kind of a softer transition. So you can build up layers, and the more layers that you add on top with the Cadian Fleshtone, towards the centre of the highlight, they'll become more opaque, which means it'll be a stronger highlight, and then towards the edges of the Cadian Fleshtone, where you haven't overlaid it quite as much, it'll be more translucent, allowing more of the Bugman's Glow to show through, which then makes it work as a transition. So here I'm using the ice yellow now, and again exactly the same thing. One little tip, you can see here I blob on a couple of the highlights, so on that little cylinder thing. The blob makes it look like it's got a glare, so you're kind of imitating that glare of a metallic effect. Be a bit careful when you do it. Again, don't have the paint too wet, because if you put a blob on when the paint's too wet, it'll just it'll spread out. Like water tension does help a little bit, but if it's too wet and you put a blob on, what will actually happen is it'll dry like a bright ring that'll be kind of more translucent in the center. So for doing these little blobs, don't apply too much paint, but if you are going to apply quite a bit of paint, make sure the paint's a bit thicker so you don't get that horrible coffee stain ring sort of effect. Now you can see I'm doing this fairly quickly, so I'm not worried too much about perfect transitions and highlights. The quality of the painting overall on the model is a very high tabletop. It's not really great for army painting. It does take a while to do this kind of stuff. It's not going to win you a golden demon, but if you painted, say, a kill team to this standard, I think it would look quite impressive on the tabletop. You can see here again those blobs of highlights. They all line up. Now, to be super correct for the highlight placement, it would depend on the angle that he's holding the gun. So, it really does depend on exactly how accurate you want to be with these things. Sometimes realism isn't as good as just making sure everything lines up and it looks good on the model. If it looks good on the model, that's always more important than if it's completely accurate. Now, I'm going on to some weathering, so I'm going to do some verdigris. For my verdigris, I have it slightly more blue, at least for this model anyway. The colours just look nicer. If you want to do more accurate verdigris, you probably have a little bit more green on it, but because the armour looks green, I find having the blue just helps a bit more. You can see I've already done some, on various other parts of the weapon, the shoulder pad, but just to go over exactly what I'm doing, it's using Sotek green, very heavily watered down, so probably 6 or 7 parts water to 1 part paint, and I'm using it almost like a wash. Now, I say that, but you have to be very careful as a wash. So the brush that I'm using is very small. It's only a size 00. So when I overload this brush, and just because it's the paint is very heavily watered down, so even a small amount of paint on that kind of floods the brush very quickly. And if you actually look near the ferrule of my brush, you can see there's lots of paint dried in there. That's from doing this kind of work where you kind of like overload the brush with paint. It is a quick way to make your brush be not as good as it should be. Now you should probably use brush soap and things like that to clean it out. I'm just a bit lazy, and I'll get a new brush or whatever as soon as it stops working. But if you want to take care of your brushes, then try not to get too much very wet paint, because it will go all the way up the bristles and flood into the the ferrule of the brush. So I mentioned it's Sotek green, very heavily watered down. It's a very, very blue green. I think you can see that as it's being applied. It's the same thing again, where it's very wet, but as it dries, it becomes, it's very wet. It looks quite a strong colour when you apply it, but as it dries, it becomes much more translucent. And because it's so wet, it's going to run into the crevices, or like if you see these rivets and things, it's going to run all the way around them. Now, if you overload it too much, so remember, these aren't contrast paints or whatever, special washes. This is just water that I've applied to these paints. So if you put too much down, it's not going to give you the cleanest effect. But the thing is, with oxidization, it's never going to look, it doesn't look super clean. You can kind of get away with these sort of rough, very uneven finishes. And also, don't forget, while the paint is drying, you can kind of like stab it with the brush and things, smear it around a little bit, so it looks more like an oxidized metal. Now, I don't want to spend too long, on this. Again, so I said it's not a golden demon piece or anything like that, but I just want to make sure it looks kind of good and interesting. So if you wanted a more realistic oxidization effect, you probably would want to do a bit of stippling and things as well, get some reference. This is a very rough approximation of for verdigris, but I think it does the job for this particular model anyway. And you can also see, so I had 2 stages there of highlight for the verdigris. So there was the Sotek green, and then I added some white to Sotek green. Use whatever white you want, doesn't really matter. At the end of the video, I am going to do some more of the non-metallic metal on the backpack, and I'm going to oxidize it as well. So you're going to get a better look at it, and I'm going to use 3 stages of oxidization for that, because it's a bigger area, is a larger amount of metal, so you want a bit more transition in there. You can see there I'm using Corvus black just to glaze in. So again, this is going to be watered down, around about 6 or 7 parts water to 1 part paint. You can see the back of the shoulder pad there and things. Like, I haven't spent too much time at the moment here on the back of the model. I'm going to put up a 360 video as well, because it's all finished now. But for the sake of this video, there's going to be a few parts where it doesn't look quite as finished, just so that I can get through it quickly to show you what I'm doing. But the Corvus black that I'm using, as I said, around about 6 or 7 parts water to 1 part paint, and it's just glazing into the shadows. It kind of dulls down the colour a little bit, and also increases the contrast. It will soften the textures that you put on there from the stippling from the first video, and just as I said, it makes everything cleaner, softer, increases the contrast, things like that. You can see I'm also using a larger brush now. So this is a size 1 brush. I'm using Artis Opus brushes. Don't worry too much if you don't use those, or can't get them or whatever. Any high quality brush is fine. But for the size wise, just having a slightly larger brush while I'm doing the glazing helps, because it allows me to load up a little bit more paint on the brush and just keep going a bit longer. Because the thing with glazing is it takes kind of a while, and when you apply it, sometimes you don't even see the effect. So you have to do multiple layers. So he's coming together slowly now. Just to finish off the front of the gun a little bit, I'm going to do some very simple non-metallic kind of steel sort of armour, not armour, whatever the bottom bit is on the gun. So starting off with some neutral grey by Vallejo, and it's exactly the same process as when I applied all the colour highlights for the copper, but this time it's obviously just different colours. So neutral grey. If you don't have that, I think Mechanicum standard grey is very, very similar. You can do the same thing with that. And all again, just hold it under a lamp if you want to see roughly how the light affects it. It'll give you the shape of the highlights as well. So on the long tube, that's like a very straight line. On the cone at the end, you can see the highlight is wider at the the wide part of the cone, and then as it gets down to the tip, it narrows down. So the highlights will follow the shape of the surface that you're using. I am doing a brown highlights. This is Mournfang brown as a bounce highlight at the bottom of this, because steel kind of like just reflects the natural colours around it. So that will be bounce highlights from the colour of the ground underneath it. However, it is a little bit dark, so I do later go back and add a bit of the neutral grey to the Mournfang brown, and just to help you see that bottom highlight there. But the bounce highlights are really the thing that help to kind of sell the non-metallic effect. And you can see I'm just using the tip of the brush just to paint in these very simple straight lines. Then I'm using pale grey blue to take the highlight a bit brighter. Now I'm not going to highlight all the way along, because that sort of defeats the object of painting it neutral grey to start with. And this will also, so it increases the contrast, so you get like these little shine points basically. If you wanted to do a more complicated way, you could do a line all the way along, but the line has to be thinner than the neutral grey below it. So that would be kind of like a thinner version of the highlights that we did for the copper above it. But this is just a quicker, easier way to do the same sort of process. So technically these highlights aren't really in the right place because they don't match the metal above it, but you don't really realize that when you look at it. It kind of works regardless. Actually, while I'm just doing that on the screen, I just wanted to talk about the armor that I stippled on in the first video as well. A few people asked me why the model looks green when I didn't paint any green on it. It's because I used Balor brown when I stippled it on. So that Balor brown is basically a yellow colour, and the natural shade for yellow is green. And I don't mean like a very kind of olivey green, dirty sort of green colour. And I don't mean from a colour theory standpoint. So in colour theory, I think is it purple or something like that is the contrast for green. For yellow, sorry. And so if that would make so if you painted purple against the yellow, that makes the colours stand out. Whereas the natural, so if you've got like a yellow ball or something and you go and hold it under a lamp, you'll find the top part, the highlight part, is kind of yellow, and then as it goes around into the shadow, it's going to look like a dirty kind of green colour. And that's basically what's happened here with the stippling. It allowed the black to just sort of come through against the yellow, and it just makes it look like a dirty green colour, from being a shaded yellow. So here you're going to see how to paint these. I don't know what they are, kind of mushroom stack things on that are attached to the model. And so I've got three colours here. I think it's Balor brown, Morghast bone, and Screaming Skull. The exact colours really don't matter too much, though. As long as you've got like three sort of colours that are sort of a browny colour and two lighter kind of bony colours, you'll be able to do the same process. Because they're not super saturated or anything like that. It's more just a case of to give it a hint of colour. And in fact, you could probably get away with using the same colours that you did for the green of the armour. But because of the way that you're going to apply it, it gives a different look. So all I'm doing is just looking for rough shapes, trying to make the brush follow the shape of the whatever it is, the bony mushroom, the fungus thing, but not completely cover the area. So I want sort of streaks of the I think I left Rhinox hide on because I covered most of the model in Rhinox hide. So you're seeing some Rhinox hide lines show through, and then you're just picking out various little parts, so you get kind of long, very translucent lines. And they don't need to be super parallel, roughly parallel to each other. They can interconnect. You can have little blobs, little faults in it. It all makes it look more interesting. And you'll see as it comes along. So the first lines that you put on with the Balor brand, they can be very sloppy and loose. And then as you get higher through the highlights, you get a bit more neater, focus more on just using the tip of the brush. So if you saw when I first applied the Balor brown, I was using more like the side of the tip of the brush. I still was a bit there as well, and it gives it like a much softer, flatter mark, whereas if you use the tip, it gives a sharper, cleaner mark. But you can just see these, like, there's gaps in between these highlights. It makes it a lot easier to paint like this. You're kind of like just looking for little faults in it, and then because you don't have to paint the whole area, you can leave areas almost unpainted, and it just works like shading. Because you've got like a very translucent layer over the top, so it looks like it's had some paint on it, but not a lot of attention. And then if you just pick up some small areas to take the, push the highlights a little bit, the high contrast, they look roughly neat, even though you've painted it quite sloppily. And I think it works for what it is. Some very simple painting. You can see here just the final highlights, just some very simple little dots and dashes and things, just looking for any little fault or maybe a line, just to make it look a bit more interesting. So, and it's important for these things to not look for perfection. Again, it's not a display piece, it's just like fun painting. I really enjoy painting these kind of models, because you can have fun, trying out new techniques. You can practice your techniques, but they don't have to be flawless. Things like perfect transitions and everything being super neat, that's something that you can save for competition painting. But learning all the basic elements of light volumes, light placement, textures, just how the paint works and things like that, it's all things that you can practice with paint marks very quickly and still get a really quite interesting result. So a lot of the painting on this model, there's nothing that's really super neat on this, and especially if you saw the first video where I did all the armor work, very simple big block stippling and things. There's not much in the way of edge highlights. You don't have to be super neat. As long as you get your highlights correct, you get some high contrast light placement and things, it looks, I think, pretty interesting anyway. Here you can see I'm painting in some of the green kind of goo stuff, and I'm just using Moot green. The light placement is very simple. It was painted Rhinox hide first, so it just takes the edge off of it being completely black when you're painting over it. Moot green covers reasonably well, but it is a big tonal jump up from Rhinox hide. So what you'll find is it looks a little bit streaky. You will have to give each highlight a few layers, but don't spend too long on it. I'm not always super keen on these parts on models where it's like dripping like goo and things, because I always feel like the scale's a little bit off. It looks kind of larger than it needs to be, but the point is that you can see it clearly when you look at the model as well, and it does look interesting, I think, because it gives a separate surface, a different texture on the model, especially because of the way that you apply the highlights on these, because so obviously you can see the texture on the armor right next to them, you can see the non-metallic with the oxidization right next to them, and then these are much more saturated, brighter green, it's like yellowy green, and if you wanted to take your time on them, put the highlight, focus the light from one side. So in this case I'm highlighting in the kind of top left area, with making sure that the big drop at the bottom has plenty of paint on it, and then I just have gone with some ice yellow again, just because I happen to have that on the palette, and just focus on as a light dot on one side. Now you can do these a little bit neater and better than I am, but they get the job done. They definitely look different surfaces, and they're a different color anyway to the other parts of the model around them. So that's really all I need them to be. if you want to just make them look a little bit more shiny, you can put so mix some of the ice yellow with the Moot green. Spend a bit more time on it, and then on the bottom right hand side, so you can see they'll put a line of Moot green that goes around the bottom. So just here, if you just put like a little dash of highlight there, it just makes them look shiny, like little jewels almost. It's just like a nice little highlight, like bounce highlight touch. Makes a slight difference to it. So now I'm going to be showing you how to do a bit more of the copper with the oxidization. You can see I started painting the canister there. That was very quick and easy. I'm going to be doing the same thing on this side, so you can see exactly how it goes. And this is more where you will see that the Bugmans glow and the Cadian Fleshtone are easier to work with basically than having to mix up your colours like I did in the first video. So first thing I'm doing with the Bugmans glow is to get a highlight placement on here. Now, when painting the back of the model, you don't have to be worry too much about the backs of models as long as they're neat. People really don't care about the back of the model, but for the highlight placement, it doesn't have to bear that much importance compared to the front of the model. So the front of the model is the important area where you look at to get all your highlight placement correct and things like that. And if you go by that, what would happen is, so all the highlights are on the front, so it means the back of the model shaded, which generally means, and when people do this for display painting, what you see is one side of the, kind of like if you've got a bust or whatever, one side is very light, bright, then as it rotates round, you'll find that it looks a bit dark, and there's not much light catching it. For gaming pieces though, it doesn't look as good when you have the back of the model where it's just really dark. Like, it's still painted, you can spend a lot of time on it, but you are looking at the back of the model, and if it's really dark, it doesn't really stand out very much. So you really have the choice of, you can paint it as bright and shiny as you want, because you don't see the front and back of the model at the same time. So as I said, they don't have to bear much relation to each other, and you're mainly going to be looking at the back of the model anyway when you're playing, if you're playing a war game, tabletop game. So if you paint the model nicely, then that's what you're going to be looking at. So the highlights that I'm doing are basically kind of copies from the front. I'm just not spending as much time on them because it's the back of the model and no one cares. But I'm still going to do some bright highlights that I still hold it under the lamp. You can see roughly where the light hits. You do need to decide if you want the light to still come from the right hand side. So if you look at the front of the model, when I paint that, my highlights tend to come from the top left. I just prefer that. It's easier when I do painting videos and things to put the light placement in those positions. And I like having an asymmetrical look to the lighting as well. It makes it a bit more interesting. But what that means is when you turn the model around, you can either, again, keep the highlights coming in from the top left, but it's a little bit jarring because you know from the front of the model that the light's coming slightly from the right hand side, so you kind of think naturally that when you turn it around, it should still come from the same direction. So if you want, you basically paint the highlights from the other side. All you have to do is just rotate the model slightly under the lamp so that it looks like the light's hitting it from the top right hand side. Pretty simple to do. If you look at the copper canister that I'm painting here, I'm focusing on making the top section of it a little bit brighter. You can see where some of the sort of these streaky long lines, they kind of connect almost at the top. And then I'm doing some sort of scribbly, scratchy marks around it to blend them together. I'm not spending a lot of time at all to make anything blend like in the traditional sense, very smooth painting. I'm just doing layers and then scratchy marks to blend the layers together. It actually works a little bit better for using those kind of marks to represent a metal surface, because I would imagine, especially for something like the Death Card, it's going to take a bit of wear and tear and get a bit of a few rough marks on there. Here you can see where I've taken it up to ice yellow now. One thing I did do on the front I haven't put the paint on the wet palette is I do put a final white dot highlight. I talked about the dot highlights using the ice yellow on the front, but just to really push it a little bit lighter, and to push the shine and high contrast, make it pop out a bit, you can do a final dot highlight with white, and just make sure you don't completely go over the ice yellow that you painted on. Here you can see I'm going back with some Mournfang brown. Now this just adds a little bit of warm colour, helps to blend in some of the transitions a bit as well, because so all the copper area was painted Rhine oxide to start with, as I already mentioned. But when you paint the Bugmans glow on, there is still a fairly big tonal jump between them, so you can see the marks quite clearly. Now if you want to just blend it in, soften it a bit, you can use some Mournfang brown like I've done there. The Mournfang brown is a fantastic colour for glazing over things. You can even have it a little bit thicker. You don't have to water it down as much, because it just has... so you could argue it from different ways. It has terrible coverage or it has great translucency. I just really like to use it because for non-metallic metal type things, it works great as for adding dirt and for adding colour to pieces. So you can see how it's working out, quite nicely there now. So the strong highlights at the top, high contrast, the streak, that's like a kind of a big highlight. It's a bit unfortunate. It's got that big sort of slab where it's connected with the two kind of rivet things on it, because that gets in the way of the highlight. Where normally if I was painting the big streak down there, I'd probably have it a little bit wider, so that the light volume is more correct for the curve, because the very thin line is too thin really. But it's sometimes you just have to fudge it. It doesn't have to be perfect. So you can see that the top of it is like a bigger highlight. That gives enough impression for the rest of it. And it can also be a case of, because it curves down and underneath, the highlight wouldn't be as strong or whatever. It's not perfect, but it does the job. So one of the little pieces I wanted to show you a bit of is the big disc here. Again, starting off with Bugman's Glow. I just want to show you this because it's a flat surface. Flat surfaces, when painting non-metallics, can be tricky. And the way that you get around it is by painting random reflections on it to make it look interesting. Because otherwise what you tend to end up with is just a very boring, simple transition. It can be like a very quick transition to make it look shiny, or it can be a slow transition to make it look more matte. But regardless, there's not a lot going on. Whereas if it was like a real metallic surface, it would be reflecting things from all the way around it. And these could be anything. They would be distorted because of the ring. But I'm not, definitely not spending that amount of time on this piece. So I'm just doing these, the kind of like fake reflections, if you like. And what is happening is, so I'm starting off making sure that the primary reflection, and if you look, there's going to be like almost like a line from the top left going down to the bottom right. That's going to be the thickest, brightest highlight. And then as we go around the disc at the sides, I'm just putting in random extra reflections. But because I'm starting off in the center, and as I go use the paint more and more, there's less paint on the brush, and it kind of like gives you a softer, more translucent mark as the paint wears off the brush. And then I'm also just making sure I catch a few of the edges and things just to make sure they're extra bright with, to push the contrast, to define the edges, make sure it's nice and clear for the shape of the object. I'm not too worried about paint catching areas or anything like that. If you make a tiny mistake like that, it's just a scratch, doesn't matter. So then on to the Cadian Fleshtone. And it's again, so just going over the highlights that you've already painted on. Again, focusing the main highlights on the big line that's going to go from top left to bottom right. Now, I'm only showing you how to paint the outer ring, but you're going to do exactly the same. Make sure all the lines kind of line up. You'll see in a moment when I finish, just taking you through these highlight steps, because the center will suddenly become painted. But you'll see how the highlight lines will line up. They should be bigger on the outer ring, and then they'll get smaller as they go in. But again, I'm not too bothered about it being perfect. As I mentioned, it's the back of the model. It's just to make sure it's all painted, get a bit of high contrast, looks slightly interesting. Onto the ice yellow. Be careful with the ice yellow on this kind of work. For the other parts, it's much easier with the curved shapes and things. you just need to put a little bit of ice yellow on this one, because it's a flat surface. When you're putting down the ice yellow, you're taking away a lot of the Bugmans glow and the Cadian Fleshtone. If you take away too much of that, it just looks like ice yellow. You've lost all the colouring on it. So keep the ice yellow to a minimum, mainly just on these primary highlight areas. And even then, if you've got a bit too much, you probably just want to go back with some of the Cadian Fleshtone just at the edges, just to soften it in. Maybe leave some of the ice yellow on the brush, touch the paint into the Cadian Fleshtone, and then just sort of feather in very roughly. It doesn't have to be a perfect transition or anything, but just very roughly at the edges, and it will help you get that kind of softer little transition in there. Here you can see I'm back with the Mournfang brown. Again, be careful with it. You add too much, it's going to take away the Bugman's glow that's in there, but it is adding that kind of nice coppery, kind of warm sort of feel to it. But so you can see, by adding the ice yellow and the Mournfang brown, you've taken away too much of the two flesh colours. So those just need bringing in a little bit more again. Tweak it, see what looks good, and it should be all right. You can see as well, so every now and then I'll put like a couple of little vertical or horizontal lines depending on what angle I'm coming in at. Again, it's just the same as the larger reflections. It's just the smaller random things that are being reflected in the metallic surface. Be careful. So that first blob of paint that I put on there was a bit too much paint on. It does work. It's fine, because it's making it look like it's like a glare, like I mentioned previously when painting the front part of the gun. But on this back section, a bit too much paint on the brush. When you blob it on there, it's definitely going to leave a three-dimensional mark on the model with that kind of level of blob of paint. But there you can see I've painted in the extra, the central disc bits, and you should see that the lines sort of roughly line up. It's not perfect again, mainly the line going from top left to bottom right, that's painted in there. And if you look at some of the other areas, I've done it very, very roughly, not even taking it up to ice yellow really, but just kept it very simple with some scratchy marks and things. And now again, we're going to be weathering this down. Now there's a big, you can see it's clearly a big block of copper all over here now. So you can be a little bit more kind of creative and just loose with how you apply it. You can flood some of the areas, and it'll look fine. It's not too much of a problem if you get a bit excessive. So I mentioned previously when I was doing the front of the gun how for the front I only used two colours when painting in the oxidization, but for the back I'm going to be using three. So you can see, you can just about see them now popping in. So the first one is just pure what was it? Sotek green. The next one is obviously Sotek green with a bit of white, and then the third one is primarily white. I've used P3 Morrow White. Don't go crazy if you can't find it. Any white is fine. I do quite like it for watering down. It just kind of, I find it flows a little bit better, but any white will do the job really. It's watered down very heavily. So by the way, that's important. They're all watered down the same amount. Just be a bit careful with the final one that's mostly white, because if you don't water that one down enough, that's more likely to make a very hard mark. The Sotek green itself is a bit more translucent, so once you've watered that down a bit, you're going to get translucency anyway. With the white paints, when you do that, there's a stronger chance that it'll make kind of like a chalky kind of finish on it, basically a little bit patchy, which again is not necessarily a massive problem for the the oxidization look, but for just general use, if you are going to water something down for glazing, like a white color, make sure you water it down a lot, because white is notorious for being awful to work with, and if you glaze white and you haven't watered it down enough, you're going to get a chalky finish, a little bit patchy. Actually, by adding the Sotek green, because it's a darker colour, you're kind of mixing in some smaller particles in with the white, so it's an off-white, and it'll flow better and get a better, cleaner finish than just something that'll be pure white. I think it's pretty obvious what I'm doing here now. So I'm just kind of almost flooding the brush, but letting the natural sort of flow of the water, the capillary action, run into the recesses, pull the water around, making sure it just gets in all the recesses pretty much. You don't have to cover the whole area. Really important, don't paint these verdigris effects over any of the bright highlights. So anything that's got ice yellow or white on it, don't go over the top of that. One, it'll make it look very blue. Two, it'll kill the highlight and the contrast. You're already knocking back the contrast with this anyway, because by painting these into the recesses, you're taking away the darkest parts. So there's no longer a black recess, if you like, which will make the highlights not quite as bright and shiny. Now, if you don't want to put any oxidization on it, it's fine. I just think it looks a little bit more interesting with it. And you can see as well, as I get the highlights, kind of like inverse highlights, really. So, you're still going over the top of them all, but make sure some of the areas you leave the plain Sotek green more visible. And then as you go through the different stages, adding more white, get it smaller and smaller, be a bit more controlled with how you do it. Still let it kind of flood into the areas to fill it up, especially into these big chunky holes. Make sure they get a lot of white in there. But for some of the other areas, it just helps to define them with a bit of the white. But don't do it on every single area, because then it becomes overpowering, kills a lot of the non-metallic effect. And then you've kind of wasted your time painting it non-metallic. And again, you really don't need to do every area, but on these kind of like sort of flat areas. So I've got the flat side of the tank at the top where I did all those little scratchy marks on. If you just keep that fairly dark using the the plain Sotek green, kind of like glaze over almost the whole thing really, because you don't want the side too bright, because that means if you keep the sides dark, the edges dark and these things, then the sharp bright edges that you've got there will have a high contrast next to them. So you've got like it still makes the bright highlights stand out. So very quickly now we're on to the final part of the model that I'm going to show you, and that's the big sort of tentacle pink thing that he's got coming out of his backpack. I don't think it's standard issue from when the backpacks were first made, but it's definitely there now. I'm using 3 colours, and they are Pink Horror, Emperor's Children, and Full Green Pink. So, and it's just the same process basically as how I applied the armor colour. I'm doing it like this because I'm being lazy, and it was the last thing I'd got to paint on it, and I just wanted to get the colours and the highlights on quickly. So, just put them on the wet palette, water it down, a good amount, 50-50 to maybe a little bit more biased towards water, and you can stipple it on very, very quickly. It's much, much quicker than layering it on, and you'll get a roughly smoother finish. If you kind of build it up, you'll see there's a few little patches of darker area. That actually makes it look more interesting, I think, with sort of a mottled skin look. I'm really not bothered about any of the details or anything like that, because at the end I'm just going to do a bit of glazing with some Mephiston red just at the edges and over the details and things, and it'll do the job. If you don't want to, you don't have to go up to full green pink. Be very careful when you do apply it though. It's a big tonal jump again up from the Emperor's Children. If you find that it's too bright or you haven't watered it down enough, just dip the brush back into the Emperor's Children while you've got some of the full green pink on there, and it'll have the same effect when I was talking about some of the other highlights earlier. And what that means is it'll just blend it on the model. So towards the edges of the transitions, it kind of will just soften it in. But also because it's so watered down, when you first apply it, the marks look stronger. When it dries, the translucency kicks in, and they look much softer marks. So here I've got some Mephiston red again, just watered down, completely flooding the area on those ribs because I just can't be bothered with them. By this stage I'm pretty much done on the model now, and I just want to get it finished. Load up the brush. I'm using a size 1. Flood the area where the ribbing is. Be careful not to flood anything else, but it just makes it look like it kind of a nasty wound, sort of open area. And then glaze up to where the pink tentacle thing connects to the bottom of the backpack, and also the other end. If you glaze in there to where it touches the gun, it makes it look kind of like a raw red wound in that case as well. One final thing that I did, just to finish it off as well, so you can see there's some little pustules on the pink tentacle. So what I actually do is I paint those like the yellow pustules on the belly. I should have seen that in the first video as well. But I just did them very, very quickly. But it fills in the area and just finishes off the details a little bit. You can just see here as well, just glazing over those the end bits a little bit. You only need probably 3 or 4 layers. I also just dab the paintbrush every now and then when there's kind of like a little recess or some sort of interesting part on the model, and it just kind of adds a little bit to that sort of fleshy look to it. And there's the final model. I will be adding a 360 video. I'll probably put that up at the same time as I post this actually. So if you look around, there should be another video for this where you can see the 360 of the model as well. But anyway, that's the end of the whole process for painting this model. I hope you enjoyed it and thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I've got lots more videos planned. And if you want to push your painting a little bit further, I do have my own website and also a Patreon. And on those two, I focus a little bit more on kind of competition painting, Golden Demon type stuff. And I'm actually working on some projects that I'll be entering into the Golden Demon when it comes around. So you might find that interesting. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.